In 1770, a precocious teenager dared to defy Pope Urban's edict. According to legend, this 14-year-old, having heard the piece only twice, went home and wrote it down from memory, thus creating possibly one of the first bootleg editions in musical history. It's astonishing to think that a teenager could remember with such apparent ease this long 12-minute piece. But then, this was no ordinary teenager. This was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. At the time, Mozart was already famous. A child prodigy, he was on a European tour with his father, and he'd been mesmerizing the nobility across the continent with his astonishing talents. While in Rome, news of his illicit transcriptions spread across the city like wildfire, and Mozart was summoned back to the Vatican by the Pope himself. The young Mozart must have known that he faced being banished from the church. However, he was in for a surprise. Instead of excommunicating him, Pope Clement XIV, much to everyone's surprise, congratulated the 14-year-old on his musical abilities. Now, after 150 years and with tacit papal approval, Allegri's Miserere could escape the confines of the Sistine Chapel. Copies of Mozart's transcription were about to spread rapidly across Europe. A few months after he'd broken the papal edict and transcribed the piece, Dr. Charles Burney, a British music enthusiast from Shrewsbury, went to see the young Mozart. Nobody is quite sure, but it'd be nice to think that Burney got a copy of the Miserere from Mozart himself. Whatever happened, he brought a copy back to England, and in 1771 he published it. It was an instant hit, not only in Georgian England, but all the way across Europe. Over the next 200 years, there were hundreds of variations of the Miserere, each one moving further away from Allegri's original. Meanwhile, Mozart continued on his European tour, and shortly after his copy of the Miserere arrived in England, he came here himself, staying for a while here in Soho, in the heart of London's West End. By the time Mozart reached London, his European tour had proved to be a huge financial success. Perhaps breaking a papal edict even enhanced his reputation. During Allegri's time, and indeed when Mozart had heard the piece, the highest parts were sung by a very particular kind of singer. They were singers who had undergone a peculiarly barbaric surgical procedure in order to preserve their unbroken voices. They were the castrati, men who had been castrated for the sake of their voice. For just over 300 years, the castrati were the star singers in the Cappella Sistina.
We have to remember, I think, that really in the sort of middle of the 1500s, they relied on the quality of the castrato singers at the time. We have to remember that the choir consisted, top three voices were all castratos.
Harry Christophers believes that the castrati embellished Allegri's original composition with their own flourishes and high notes, and that's the real reason why the work became so highly prized by the Vatican.
Probably why there's this feeling that if Allegri's work was ever released out of the Sistine Chapel, somebody would face excommunication, etc. I think that was to do much, much more with the embellishments. They were the trade secret. It was those embellishments that weren't allowed to get out.
One of the earliest accounts of a castrati singing the piece with the soaring high notes we know today came in the early 19th century from another famous musical figure, a German, Felix Mendelssohn. Quite apart from being a great composer, Felix Mendelssohn was also something of a musical historian. He championed the music of many great composers, and after a trip to the Vatican, it seems he was also one of the first to note down Allegri's Miserere with the famous high notes. Harry Christophers has been working with his singers on this higher version that Mendelssohn heard.
I actually really enjoy singing the piece. For me, it sits quite comfortably in my voice, and I quite like singing high. The hardest thing actually is singing in the quartet, because the hardest thing is getting the harmonies right and keeping the tuning between the four of you. So although it seems as though the top C is the impressive, amazing thing that comes out from nowhere, you've got to think that the quartet are normally pulling together as a team and trying to make sure that the whole thing works.
This is King's College, Cambridge, home to one of the most famous choirs in the world. In the 1960s, they performed the new version of Allegri's Miserere, this time in English. It was written by Sir Ivor Atkins, choir master of Worcester Cathedral, who had brought together many different interpretations of Allegri's Miserere, including extracts from Burney's and Mendelssohn's transcriptions. In 1963, Sir Ivor's successor at Worcester, who then became choir master of King's College, Cambridge, decided to record Sir Ivor's version. It would prove to be a phenomenal success. That choir master was Sir David Wilcox. Now, the big question, of course, that most people want to know is about the famous treble solo which goes up to a very, very high C.
Ah, this is Roy Goodman, who was a very, very good chorister. He came from Hull in Yorkshire. I should think he was 12 and a half, maybe 13, because he's
at the end of his career as treble solo.
Yes, we were already waiting to go, and Roy Goodman hadn't arrived. And I thought, oh dear, I'm sure I said 4, you know, but he arrived breathless. About 5 minutes later, he said, I'm terribly sorry, we had a rugger match today, and I was captain. I couldn't leave, and it was so good I couldn't believe it, because it is a difficult piece.
After its release in 1963, the record proved to be a phenomenal success, becoming a classic in its own right. For 3.5 centuries, Allegri's Miserere has changed and evolved as each new generation has interpreted it for itself. There's no way of knowing if that was Allegri's intention, but in any case, the piece has become one of the most popular and enduring pieces of sacred music ever written. And now to perform the piece in its entirety in Latin, with those famous high notes, is Harry Christophers and his choir, the 16.